He was a former Navy veteran, with nothing left but an old dog and a broken past. He spent his last dollars on a forgotten cabin buried in winter, hoping the silence would save him. But when he arrived, the snow felt wrong. His retired sheen stopped cold, growling low. The gate creaked in the wind, and beneath it hung a young woman, frozen, beaten, barely alive. He came seeking peace. What he found was a trap, a life hanging by a thread, and a secret powerful enough to destroy a town. Cold settled into the day before the sun had fully risen, the kind of cold that crept under skin and stayed there, quiet and patient, like a memory that never quite faded. Elias Thorne returned from the war carrying a body that felt older than the years printed on his identification card. At 49, he moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned which motions would hurt and which ones he could still afford. Shoulders broad, but sloped forward from years of carrying weight, physical and otherwise. His face was sharp-edged and weather-worn, framed by an uneven beard threaded with gray, grown not from neglect, but from indifference to mirrors. Sleep rarely came easily, and when it did, it never stayed. His nights were stitched together from shallow rest and sudden waking, his mind replaying sounds and moments it refused to let go. He did not talk about it. The war had ended on paper, but inside him, it simply lived differently now, quieter, less dramatic, yet no less heavy. Elias survived the way many men like him did, by working. Not a career, not a future, just work, lifting, carrying, fixing, digging, shoveling. Labor that left his hands split and sore, but kept his thoughts occupied long enough to make the days pass. He moved from place to place, never rooted long enough to be missed. There was no family waiting, no warm kitchen, only the road, the weight of his jacket, and the quiet understanding that stability was something other people managed to earn. To those who passed him by, Elias was just another tired laborer, clothes faded, boots scuffed, speaking little, and moving on quickly. Some saw him as invisible, others saw him as a reminder of something they preferred not to think about. Elias didn't mind. He had stopped needing recognition a long time ago. What he did need walked beside him. Bear had been with him through places neither of them could fully forget. The German shepherd was old now, muzzle pale with gray, movements slowed by age and long service. But his eyes remained sharp and watchful, trained to run toward danger and stay when others fled. Bear still carried those instincts. He stayed close, always slightly behind Elias's left side, stopping when Elias stopped, keeping watch when Elias slept. To the outside world, Bear was simply an aging dog following his owner. But in Bear's eyes, Elias was still something more. The man whose commands had once mattered, the presence that meant safety and purpose. On cold mornings, when Elias's hands shook, Bear leaned into him. On restless nights, the dog's solid warmth anchored him. Elias fed Bear before himself, planned his days around the dog's limits, accepting without question that some responsibilities were not negotiable. Elias knew how small his life had become, how narrow his world had grown. He did not resent it. Resentment required energy he no longer wasted. Instead, he focused on what remained, putting one foot in front of the other, keeping Bear healthy, surviving each night without losing himself to the past. And then, one quiet afternoon in the cold, Elias made a decision so small it barely felt like one at all. He did not yet know where it would lead. But as he and Bear walked forward together, something subtle shifted. A direction had been set toward a place neither of them could yet imagine, one that would change everything. Elias spent the last of his money, the way men without safety nets often did, quietly, without witnesses, without the expectation of being proven right. The cabin had been seized years earlier, tucked deep into the mountains, where winter ruled longer than it should. The price was absurdly low, low enough that no one asked questions anymore. Elias didn't either. He signed the paper, handed over the cash, and drove away with the uneasy calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. The road climbed steadily, snow narrowing it into a pale corridor, the sky above pressed flat and gray. Elias drove in silence, jaw set, hands steady on the wheel, while Bear sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the darkening forest ahead, as if measuring distance, threat, and time. The farther they went, the heavier the quiet became. Trees crowded closer to the road, their branches bare and reaching, coated in ice that caught the weak winter light. The truck engine sounded too loud here, intrusive, as if it didn't belong. Elias felt it then, that subtle tightening in his chest, the familiar sensation of entering a place where instincts mattered more than logic. He slowed without thinking. Bear shifted beside him, posture changing, spine straightening, ears beginning to lift. They were both listening now, though neither could have said for what. The cabin appeared suddenly, not welcoming, but crouched, half hidden by snow and shadow. It sat back from the road, roof sagging, walls darkened by years of weather, as if the forest were slowly reclaiming it. Elias cut the engine. Silence fell instantly, thick and unnatural. He opened the door and stepped out, boots sinking into snow. The cold bit hard, sharp enough to sting. Bear jumped down after him and then stopped. The change in the dog was immediate and unmistakable. Bear froze mid-step, body locked, muscles drawn tight beneath graying fur. His ears snapped upright, every line of him angled forward. His tail dropped low, rigid. This was not hesitation. This was recognition. Elias turned at once, heart rate climbing, scanning the trees, the cabin, the ground. "What is it?" he murmured, though he already knew better than to expect an answer. Bear did not look back. His amber eyes were fixed ahead, unblinking, focused on something Elias had not yet seen. The gate stood between them and the cabin, a simple wooden arch once meant to mark an entrance, now warped and leaning. One hinge groaned softly as the wind pushed against it, the sound carrying too far in the stillness. Elias took a step closer, then another, following Bear's rigid line of sight. Snow creaked beneath his boots. His breath fogged in front of him, and then he saw it. At first, his mind rejected the shape entirely. It didn't belong here. It was wrong in the way only something deeply human could be. Hanging from the beam of the gate was a figure, suspended and unmoving, outlined starkly against the white of the snow. A woman. Her body sagged slightly to one side, boots dusted pale, coat stiff with frost. For a heartbeat, Elias could not move. His chest tightened as if all the air had been pulled from it at once. Time slowed, narrowed, focused entirely on that impossible sight. She looked small against the gate, her frame slender beneath the winter clothing. Dark hair spilled loose from beneath a hat, frozen strands clinging to her face. Her skin was pale, features indistinct beneath ice and shadow. Her arms were pulled behind her, posture unnatural, helpless. Elias felt the old surge rise up inside him, the one that came before action, before thought. Shock gave way to something sharper, colder. Bear broke the silence with a single sharp bark, the sound cutting through the frozen air. He moved then, circling beneath the gate, whining low, frantic energy replacing his earlier stillness. Elias's heart hammered in his ears. He did not think about consequences. He did not consider why she was there, or who might have put her there. There would be time for questions later, if later existed at all. He ran. Snow sprayed under his boots as he surged forward, pain flaring through his shoulder, breath tearing from his lungs. His focus tunneled, the world shrinking to the gate. The woman, the seconds slipping away. Somewhere behind him, the forest remained silent, watching. Elias did not know that this moment, this single, desperate rush forward, had already closed the door on the life he had known. He only knew that whatever waited beyond that gate had claimed him now, whether he was ready or not. Elias reached the gate and cut the rope without ceremony, fingers numb and clumsy in the cold, blades sawing through frozen fiber as if time itself resisted him. The woman collapsed into his arms with a weight that felt wrong, not heavy, not light, but emptied, as though warmth had already begun to leave her. He staggered, boots slipping, then steadied and lowered her to the snow, heart hammering with the instinctive urgency he remembered from places where hesitation killed. Up close, he saw her clearly. She was in her early 30s, slender, slightly tall, her narrow frame rigid beneath a winter coat torn at the elbow. Chestnut brown hair lay stiff with frost against pale cheeks dusted with faint freckles. Her skin nearly translucent, lips cracked and blue. Her hands were bound behind her back with coarse rope, wrists swollen and raw, fingers curled inward as if clinging to the last trace of warmth. There was no drama in her face, only the stillness of someone abandoned, for the cold to finish the work. Bear barked sharply and dropped beside her without command, pressing his long body against her side as if he could force heat back into her through sheer will. Age had softened the German shepherd's once formidable build, gray at his muzzle, stiffness in his hips, but none of it dulled the urgency in his amber eyes as they flicked between her face and Elias's hands. Elias shrugged out of his jacket, tucked it tightly around her shoulders, and cut through the frozen rope, ignoring the pain flaring through his shoulder. He leaned close, ear near her mouth, counting breaths, thin, uneven. But there, he lifted her carefully, feeling how rigid her limbs were, how little resistance her body offered, and carried her toward the cabin, as Bear moved ahead like a guide. Inside, the air was stale but still, smelling of old wood and dust. Elias laid her near the fireplace and knelt again, rubbing her hands between his own, willing sensation back into them. In the dim light, her features softened, a straight nose, fine lines at the corners of her eyes, a mouth more accustomed to listening than speaking. Ordinary, in a way that made what had been done to her feel unbearable. Bear lay beside her, head low, ears twitching at every creak, time blurred, measured by Elias's breathing and the dog's restless shifting. Then, she stirred. A faint sound escaped her throat. Her eyelids fluttered and opened to hazel eyes ringed with green, sharp with fear through the fog of the cold. She tried to speak and failed. Elias stayed visible and steady. "You're inside," he said quietly. "You're alive." Her gaze drifted to Bear, tension easing when the dog did not move away, his presence solid and calm. She swallowed painfully and whispered a name. "Sarah." Elias repeated it softly and offered his own. Names were enough. He watched the fear beneath her composure, the hitch in her breath when she realized her hands were free, the instinctive bracing for something worse. "You're safe for the moment," he said carefully. "You don't have to talk." Bear shifted closer, his shoulder pressing gently against her hip, a promise made without words. As Sarah lay trembling, Elias felt the truth settle in. People were not left hanging in the cold by accident. Someone had wanted her silent, and trusted winter to erase her. Looking around the cracked walls and dark corners of the cabin, Elias understood. His search for a place to disappear had ended the moment he cut that rope. Whatever Sarah carried had followed her here, and by saving her, he had stepped into it. Outside, the wind brushed the cabin like a warning, and Elias remained kneeling beside an old dog, and a woman pulled back from the edge, knowing the line he had crossed could no longer be uncrossed. The fire Elias managed to coax from old kindling burned low and uneven, throwing restless shadows across the cabin walls. Sarah lay wrapped in blankets near the hearth, color slowly returning to her face in fragile stages. When she finally found enough breath to speak, her voice was soft, but steady, shaped by restraint rather than weakness. Sarah Mitchell was not a drifter or a reckless seeker of trouble. She was the kind of woman people trusted without realizing it. Early 30s, slender with calm, hazel eyes, and a composed posture that came from listening more than talking. She had grown up in the nearby town, one of those places where everyone knew each other's names but not their secrets. Sarah worked quietly with families others overlooked, helping them navigate evictions, unpaid hospital bills, missing paperwork, small mercies that kept lives from unraveling. It was that work, she said, that taught her how power hid itself behind politeness. As her strength returned, so did the memories she had been holding back. Sarah told Elias that she had not gone looking for corruption. It had found her instead. In helping a struggling family, she had stumbled onto records that did not align, properties seized too quickly, funds redirected, names appearing where they should not. She had asked questions gently at first, believing there must be an explanation. But questions, she learned, were dangerous things when asked of the wrong people. The men she described were not monsters in appearance. They wore clean coats, spoke calmly, shook hands in public. Power, Sarah realized too late, rarely announced itself with violence until it was certain it would not be challenged. Elias listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, though something hard had settled behind his eyes. He did not need details yet. The shape of the story was enough. They had not killed her immediately because death would have drawn attention. Instead, they had chosen spectacle disguised as misfortune, hanging her at the gate of a seized cabin in winter, trusting exposure and isolation to erase her quietly. Elias felt a familiar anger stir, slow and controlled, the kind born not of rage, but of recognition. He had seen this logic before, in different uniforms, under different flags. Sarah's voice never rose as she spoke. That frightened him more than panic would have. While she talked, Bear grew restless. The German shepherd paced near the hearth, nails scraping softly against the wooden floor. His ears stayed pinned forward, his body angled toward the old stone fireplace, as if it were an open doorway. He let out a low growl. Not loud, not aggressive, but insistent. Sarah paused mid-sentence, eyes flicking toward the sound. Elias had noticed it too. Bear had been trained to detect what others missed. Movement, scent, disturbance. Age had dulled his joints, not his instincts. When he began pawing at the base of the hearth, scraping soot and ash aside, Elias felt the air in the room shift. The dog was not anxious. He was focused. Elias rose slowly, every sense alert, and approached the fireplace. The stones were old, blackened by decades of smoke, but one section looked different, cleaner at the edges. Disturbed, Bear's growl deepened as he pressed his nose against it, tail rigid. Sarah watched, something like recognition flickering across her face, though she said nothing yet. Elias knelt and brushed ash away with his gloved hand. Beneath it, the stone shifted slightly under pressure, not loose enough to fall, loose enough to hide something. Elias did not remove it. Not yet. He met Sarah's gaze. And in that moment, understanding passed between them without words. Sarah exhaled shakily. She told him that when she realized what she had uncovered, she had tried to gather proof, not to expose anyone publicly, but to protect herself. She had hidden copies, trusting instinct over logic, knowing that truth without safety was just another kind of risk. She did not know if what she had hidden was still there, or if it mattered anymore. Elias felt the weight of her words settle heavily in the room. This was no longer about shelter from the cold. This was about something people had been willing to kill, to keep buried. Elias straightened, the decision forming quietly, solidly. He did not promise protection. He did not reassure her with words he could not guarantee. Instead, he said only, "They won't stop." Sarah nodded. She already knew. Bear returned to her side, pressing close as if sensing the shift. Elias understood then that saving Sarah's life had been the easy part. What followed would require patience, vigilance, and a willingness to stand in the way of forces that preferred their violence clean and unseen. The cabin, once a place Elias had chosen to disappear, had become something else entirely. A threshold. And Sarah was not just someone who needed rescue. She was carrying a truth that frightened powerful people. And by listening, Elias had made himself part of it. Elias waited until Sarah slipped into an exhausted, shallow sleep before returning to the fireplace. The cabin had grown quiet in a way that sharpened rather than soothed. Kneeling at the hearth, he pried the loosened stone free with slow, controlled pressure. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth blackened by soot, lay a thin bundle of papers, old property transfers, handwritten notes, copied records. At first glance, they looked ordinary, but patterns emerged as he scanned them. Names repeating, dates overlapping where they should not, assets moving too fast and too clean. Elias did not need every detail. He understood the shape of it. This was leverage. This was motive. This was why Sarah had been silenced instead of ignored. He folded the papers back into the cloth and slid them inside his jacket. As he straightened, Bear rose in a single smooth motion, body rigid, ears snapping forward. Elias felt it a heartbeat later, a faint vibration beneath the floor, then light flickering between the trees. Headlights. Slow, deliberate, not passing through, coming here. Elias's breathing steadied as something old and familiar locked into place. The men who had left Sarah hanging had returned to make sure winter had finished its work. The engine cut outside, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. Elias dimmed the lantern and guided Sarah behind the thickest section of wall, murmuring for her to stay low. Fear flashed in her eyes, but she nodded. Bear positioned himself at the door, broad chest squared, tail low, teeth just visible as a quiet growl built in his throat. He was no longer resting by the fire. He was a barrier. Elias took his place behind him, shoulders loose, weight balanced, mapping every sound. The crunch of snow, one set of footsteps, then another, at least two, possibly more. Elias recognized the rhythm instantly. Men who believed themselves untouchable. He pictured them without seeing their faces. Middle-aged, well-fed, dressed for cold rather than hardship, hands used to authority more than labor. Men who spoke softly when threatening and smiled when lying. Bear's growl deepened as a shadow crossed the window. Elias rested a hand lightly on the dog's shoulder, grounding him without restraint. He would need Bear exactly where he was. The door handle rattled. A low, irritated voice followed. "This is a waste of time." Another replied, calmer, sharper. "Check anyway." Elias felt no rush of anger, no spike of fear. What replaced it was clarity. The small, invisible life he had been living fell away. In its place stood the man he had been trained to be, patient, controlled, unwilling to let harm pass unchecked. He was not fighting for vengeance. He was standing because someone inside this cabin did not deserve to die quietly for knowing the truth. The door opened, a fraction, and Bear surged forward in a single controlled burst, barking fierce and loud, his body filling the gap. Elias stepped in behind him. Back away. He did not shout. He did not need to. A flashlight beam jerked, catching Bear's bare teeth and Elias's steady silhouette. One man swore. Another stepped back, boots sliding in the snow. They had expected a body. They had not expected resistance. Snow drifted between them as the men hesitated, calculation flickering across their faces. Complications drew attention, and attention brought consequences. Footsteps sounded along the side of the cabin. More movement, more shadows. Elias's jaw tightened. This was not finished. Not tonight. The men retreated, melting back into the trees as engines turned over in the distance. Bear held his position long after the sound faded. Only when the night settled did Elias secure the door and turn back to Sarah. She was awake, watching him silently. No questions, no reassurances. The papers in his jacket were not just evidence. They were an invitation for danger to return. Outside, snow fell steadily, covering tracks, but not erasing what had been set in motion. The storm arrived without warning, swallowing the forest in a white roar that turned distance into guesswork and sound into threat. Elias did not hesitate. He wrapped Sarah tighter, checked Bear's flank by touch alone, and made the decision. Veterans learn to make quickly. Leave now, or be buried here. Snow cut sideways. Stinging exposed skin. The wind strong enough to steal breath from lungs. Bear moved first, head low, shoulders rolling through drifts with stubborn precision. A thin dark line of blood, marking where ice had torn skin, but not spirit. Elias followed with Sarah pressed behind him. One arm hooked around her waist to keep her upright, his body angled to take the worst of the wind. He felt every step in his bones, the old injuries flaring, but he kept moving because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant silence. They reached the structure by accident or instinct. An abandoned maintenance shed half sunk into a slope, its metal door hanging crooked, painted a bare gray. Inside, the air was colder, but still, a hollow that cut the wind's voice to a dull moan. Elias barred the door with a length of rusted pipe and pulled Sarah down behind a stack of crates. She was shaking hard now, fear and cold tangling together, her face pale but focused. Elias kept her close, his back to the door. He pressed his forehead briefly to hers, grounding them both. Bear circled once and lay down at the entrance, chest heaving, ears forward, eyes bright. The dog's injury was shallow. Elias could tell by the way Bear still shifted his weight evenly, but it would hurt in the cold. Still, Bear did not yield an inch. Hours stretched and folded in on themselves. The storm grew louder, then quieter, then loud again, like a living thing searching for them. Elias's legs trembled with exhaustion, his hands numb enough to make fine movement a gamble. Yet his mind stayed sharp. He listened for engines beneath the wind, for voices carried wrong, for the crunch that didn't belong to falling snow. Sarah stayed silent, breathing slow the way he had taught her, eyes tracking his face for cues. When Bear lifted his head and growled. Not loud, just enough. Elias knew they were close again. Shadows passed beyond the thin walls. A door handle rattled somewhere. Elias shifted Sarah farther behind him, braced himself, and waited. The waiting broke when light cut through the snow outside, headlights swinging wide, then stopping. Not one vehicle. Several voices followed, sharper and louder than before, carrying authority that did not bother to whisper. Orders, names, the sound of boots rushing where minutes earlier there had been careful steps. Elias exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours, the tension in his shoulders loosening by degrees. The door banged open, cold flooding in, and men in heavy coats moved past without looking twice at Elias or Sarah. They moved with purpose now, not confidence. The difference mattered. Outside, raised voices answered back. Someone protested. Someone else shouted for cuffs. Elias helped Sarah to her feet when it was safe, his hands steady despite the tremor running through him. Bear struggled up as well, favoring his side for a moment before planting himself squarely again, tail giving a single tired sweep. In the spill of light, faces resolved, uniforms dusted with snow, eyes alert and unamused. One officer paused to look at Elias, taking in the posture, the set of the jaw, the way he positioned himself without thinking. There was recognition there, brief and respectful. And then the work continued. The men who had returned to finish what winter started were led away, protest swallowed by wind and engines. When the storm finally eased, it left the world reshaped, quiet, bright, and aching. Sarah stood in the open, shoulders squared beneath borrowed layers, alive in a way that felt newly earned. Elias stood beside her, snow clinging to his beard, breath fogging, beer pressed against his leg like an anchor. For the first time in years, Elias felt the future widen rather than narrow. He did not mistake it for peace, but it was space enough to step forward, enough to choose again. As the lights pulled away and the forest settled, Elias understood something he had forgotten how to say. His life had not ended in the places he thought it had. It had simply been waiting for a night long enough to test it, and a dawn strong enough to prove it could continue. Spring came slowly to the mountain, not all at once, but in small, stubborn signs. The snow thinning at the edges of the clearing, the soil softening beneath boots, the light lingering a little longer each evening. Elias rebuilt the gate first. He worked with measured patience, sanding splintered wood, replacing the cracked beam that had once held death where welcome should have been. His hands were still rough, his right shoulder still unreliable, but he worked anyway, piece by piece, until the gate stood straight again. When he finally set it back into place, it no longer creaked like a warning. It opened wide, clean, and quiet. An entrance, instead of a threat. Elias stayed. The decision was never spoken aloud, but it shaped his days all the same. He repaired the roof before the rains came, mended the porch, sealed the windows, and learned which boards groaned only from age, and which ones needed replacing. He moved through the cabin with a familiarity that surprised him, as if his body recognized the work as something it had been waiting to do. The man who had once drifted from job to job now rose each morning with a place to stand, and a reason to stay. He was still quiet, still carried his past carefully, but the heaviness no longer defined every step. For the first time in years, the nights ended in rest instead of vigilance. Sarah returned when the thaw made the road passable. She arrived, not as someone seeking refuge, but as someone carrying purpose. The marks winter had left on her, faded bruises, pale scars at the wrists, had not erased her steadiness. She was still slender, still moved with calm intention, chestnut hair now worn loose in the sunlight, skin warmed back to its natural tone. What had changed was her resolve. Sarah spoke with the town quietly, the same way she always had. But now people listened differently. The cabin became more than shelter. It became a place where those who had fallen through cracks could rest without explanation. Sarah organized what Elias built, turning rooms into warmth and routine, into something that felt like safety without rules or judgment. Bear claimed the porch as his own. Age had settled more deeply into his frame by spring, silver spreading across his muzzle and brow, but his eyes remained clear and attentive. He lay in the sun with a dignity earned over years of service, lifting his head whenever someone approached, tail thumping once in recognition before settling again. The small injury from the winter healed cleanly, leaving only a thin line beneath fur. Children who arrived with their parents learned quickly that Bear was gentle but observant, a guardian who did not bark without reason. He never strayed far from Elias or Sarah, content to watch the gate that no longer needed watching. The town changed its language slowly. People stopped referring to the place as that cabin and began calling it by name. Those who came carried stories they did not know where else to leave. Loss, displacement, fear that had nowhere to rest. Elias listened, more than he spoke, offering what he could: repairs, meals, steady presence. Sarah handled the rest with practiced grace, guiding without commanding, reminding people of their own strength rather than lending them hers. Together, they built something that did not try to erase the past, but refused to be defined by it. On one quiet afternoon, Elias stood at the gate and watched the light move across the clearing. The memories were still there. He did not expect them to vanish, but they no longer owned him. He had crossed a line that winter night and discovered that purpose could return in unexpected forms, not as redemption, not as reward, but as responsibility freely chosen. Sarah joined him, resting a hand on the rebuilt post, and Bear settled between them, solid and warm. None of them spoke. They did not need to. The gate stood open, not because danger no longer existed, but because fear no longer ruled the threshold. The old soldier, the woman once left between life and death, and the dog who never walked away, had not undone what happened to them. They had done something harder. They had learned how to live forward, together, in a place where the past was acknowledged, the present was held with care, and the future finally felt possible. Sometimes the miracles we pray for do not arrive with thunder or light from the sky. They arrive quietly, through broken people who choose not to turn away. Elias did not come to the mountains looking to be a hero. Sarah did not expect to survive the night, and Bear did not know that staying once more would change everything. Yet somehow, they were placed in the same place at the same moment, on the coldest night of winter, not to erase their pain, but to carry it together until healing became possible. Life often feels the same way. Many of us are tired. Many of us feel forgotten, overlooked, or worn down by seasons that seem too long and too cold. But this story reminds us of a quiet truth. Help arrives in unexpected forms: a stranger, a second chance, a loyal companion, or the courage to stand when walking away would be easier. Your story is not over. Your gate will not always be a place of fear, and even the longest night can give way to morning.